It's 1851, and a woman named Mary is standing ankle-deep in the muck of a Bermondsey alleyway, scraping something off the cobblestones with her bare hands. She drops it into a leather pail that's already half full. The smell is indescribable. A gentleman passing on the main road covers his nose and quickens his pace, but Mary doesn't flinch. She's been at this since 4 in the morning, and by noon she'll have earned more than the seamstress 2 streets over makes in a full day. What's in that bucket? Dog feces, and in Victorian London it was worth its weight in, well, not gold, but something surprisingly close. This is the story of the pure finders and the grotesque but booming waste economy that kept one of the world's greatest cities running. But to understand how collecting dog poop became a legitimate and even competitive profession, we need to go back a few centuries to the origins of one of England's oldest industries. Leather has been essential to civilization for thousands of years, but turning raw animal hide into usable leather is one of the most revolting processes humans have ever devised. By the medieval period, English tanners had developed a multi-step method that could take months. First, hides were soaked in vats of urine to loosen the hair and fat. Then they were scraped, stretched, and beaten. But the critical step, the one that made leather soft, supple, and workable, was called baiting, and baiting required something very specific, an alkaline paste, rich in enzymes that could break down the proteins in the hide without destroying it. For centuries, tanners discovered that the best source of these enzymes was animal dung, and not just any dung. Dog feces, which the tanners called pure, was considered the finest baiting agent available. The word itself likely came from the idea that dog dung purified the leather, stripping away the last traces of unwanted material and leaving a clean, white, flexible skin. Pigeon droppings worked reasonably well. Chicken dung was acceptable in a pinch, but pure dog excrement was the gold standard, and as England's leather industry expanded through the 16th and 17th centuries, demand for this unlikely raw material grew steadily. Tanners in Bermondsey, the heart of London's leather district, needed a constant, reliable supply. Somebody had to go out and get it. By the late 1700s, London was a city of roughly 1 million people and an almost uncountable number of dogs. Strays roamed every neighborhood. Working dogs pulled carts, guarded properties, and herded livestock through the city streets. Pets were increasingly fashionable among the middle and upper classes. The result was an enormous daily output of dog waste scattered across every lane, alley, park, and gutter in the metropolis. And so a profession was born. The pure finders emerged as a distinct class of London's labouring poor, individuals who made their living exclusively by walking the streets and collecting dog dung. They carried buckets or baskets lined with cloth, and they worked methodically, covering regular routes the way a mail carrier would. They knew which neighborhoods had the most dogs. They knew which times of day were most productive. They knew that the drier, chalkier specimens were more valuable to the tanners than fresh ones, because the calcium and phosphorus content was higher. This wasn't mindless scavenging. It was skilled, strategic work, and the people who did it treated it as a trade. By the early 19th century, pure finding had become a recognized occupation in London's vast informal economy. And contrary to what you might expect, the money was not bad at all. Henry Mayhew, the great Victorian journalist and social researcher, documented the pure finders extensively in his landmark work, London Labour and the London Poor, published in the early 1850s. What he found surprised even him. Mayhew estimated that somewhere between 200 and 300 people worked as full-time pure finders in London at any given time. Many were elderly women, often widows with no other means of support. Some were older men, too broken down by years of manual labor to work in factories or on the docks. A few were children. They worked long hours, typically starting before dawn and walking 6 to 8 miles a day. And they earned, on average, about 6 shillings a week. To put that in perspective, an unskilled laborer in a factory might earn 8 or 9 shillings for a grueling 60-hour week. A pure finder working independently, setting their own hours, with no foreman screaming at them, could earn nearly as much. Some of the more industrious collectors reportedly earned even more, especially those who had established direct relationships with particular tanneries and could negotiate better prices. The going rate fluctuated, but a good bucket of dry, high-quality pure could fetch sixpence or more. Mayhew interviewed several pure finders, and their accounts are fascinating. Many expressed a kind of quiet dignity about their work. One elderly woman told him she'd been in the trade for 15 years and preferred it to domestic service because she was her own mistress. She answered to no one. She came and went as she pleased. Yes, the work was foul, but in a city where the alternatives for an aging, uneducated woman were the workhouse or starvation, pure finding offered something genuinely rare: independence. But the pure finders were just one thread in a vast and astonishing tapestry of waste-based occupations that kept Victorian London functioning. The city produced filth on an almost incomprehensible scale, and nearly every form of that filth had economic value to someone. Night soil men emptied cesspits and outdoor privies under cover of darkness, hauling away thousands of tons of human waste that was then sold to farmers as fertilizer. It was backbreaking, nauseating work, but night soil men were among the best-paid laborers in the city, earning sometimes 2 to 3 times what a regular worker made, precisely because so few people could stomach the job. Then there were the bone collectors who gathered animal bones from butcher shops, slaughterhouses, and street gutters. Bones were ground into fertilizer, boiled for gelatin, or burned to make bone char, which was essential for refining sugar. Rag and bone men collected scraps of cloth and old clothing, which were pulped and recycled into paper. Mudlarks, often children, waded into the Thames at low tide to scavenge for coal, nails, copper, rope, and anything else of value dropped or washed into the river. And perhaps most dramatically, there were the knackers, who dealt with the city's dead horses. Victorian London relied on tens of thousands of working horses, and roughly 1,000 of them dropped dead in the streets every year. Knackers would arrive with carts, haul the carcass away, and process every last piece of it. The hide went to tanners. The bones went to glue factories and sugar refineries. The fat was rendered into tallow for candles and soap. The hooves were boiled down for gelatin. The hair was stuffed into mattresses. Even the blood was collected and dried into cakes that were sold as fertilizer or animal feed. Absolutely nothing was wasted. Victorian London was, in the most literal and revolting sense, a recycling economy. Every byproduct of life and death had a buyer, and an army of workers existed to connect supply with demand. The pure finders began to disappear in the second half of the 19th century, and the reasons were both technological and cultural. In the 1860s and 70s, chemical advances in the tanning industry introduced synthetic alternatives to traditional baiting agents. Chromium salts, various chemical compounds, and eventually manufactured enzyme preparations could do what dog dung had done for centuries, and they could do it faster, more consistently, and without the smell. Tanneries began switching over, and the price they'd pay for pure dropped accordingly. At the same time, London itself was changing. The great public health reforms of the mid-Victorian era, driven by men like Edwin Chadwick and Joseph Bazalgette, were transforming the city's relationship with its own waste. Sewers were being built, streets were being cleaned. The idea that a modern civilized metropolis should have people crawling through its gutters collecting animal excrement was increasingly seen as an embarrassment. The Metropolitan Streets Act and various local ordinances began regulating waste collection, pushing informal scavengers to the margins. By the 1880s, pure finding as a profession had essentially vanished. The last generation of collectors aged out of the work, and no one replaced them. The tanneries had moved on, the streets were cleaner, the world had changed. But for roughly a century, these overlooked, often elderly, mostly female workers had quietly sustained one of England's most important industries with nothing but a bucket, a strong stomach, and a pair of worn-out shoes. So here's what I want you to argue about. The pure finders were independent. They set their own schedules, they answered to no one, and they earned a competitive wage doing work that most people wouldn't touch. Some modern gig economy workers describe their jobs in almost identical terms. So the question is this: were the pure finders proto-entrepreneurs making the best of a free market? Or were they desperate people exploited by a system that left them no better option than handling filth? Drop your take below, because I genuinely think there's a strong case on both sides. And if you want more stories about the strange, disgusting, and deeply human side of history that textbooks leave out, this channel is where they live. Come along for the ride.